What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. I thought off the back of me doing kind of the series that I did on movie franchises, I thought why not talk about some of the movie franchises that I like, but with a little bit of a twist. So I wanted to talk about, because I noticed a bit of a trend and a pattern here historically with some franchises and in particular trilogies, in which a fourth film was made and it kind of ruined the franchise. That is, it kind of tainted what were three perfectly good movies or serviceable movies beforehand. So I've got here a list of four that I physically own, one I don't. So I'll just talk about that, but I'll talk about that one as opposed to kind of giving you a kind of example to show. But five movie trilogies that I think were utterly ruined by the existence and the presence of a fourth one being made. So, it's a bit different because what I'm talking about is trilogies of movies that actually had investment in the first place, which is why it differs from that's why these wouldn't be included in my film franchises. It's also a reason why when I did my film franchises that I hated or were indifferent towards, I didn't really include horror. Partly because it's kind of low-hanging fruit, and horror is so susceptible to having that kind of really good first movie or interesting movie, and then just having sequels that never live up to the original. It's why I'm not really interested in kind of ranking horror franchises actually, or watching people that do, or hearing people's takes. No, I'm not interested in hearing people's takes, I suppose, but a lot of the time the first one's usually the best, isn't it? It's very rare that you get the second horror movie topping the first, in my opinion. And certainly the case with diminishing returns with 3, 4, and 5 and 6, etc. And some of them have over like a dozen sequels now. It's ridiculous. So with that, let's get started into these five trilogies that I think were completely spoiled, really, in some cases by like I say, the existence of a fourth movie. If you are new to this channel, by the way, I've got a playlist of the movie franchises that I don't like, that I'm speaking of, and of course, welcome. And if you like the video, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe with your thoughts and opinions if you agree, disagree, or the movie trilogies that you like personally. Or maybe even like the sequels that there's a sequel that ruined the franchise for you. It doesn't necessarily have to be the fourth one. It could be maybe the third one or the fifth, for example, or something. But like I say, I really noticed a pattern with the fourth one being an issue for me. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the Bourne trilogy. What was the Bourne trilogy? Now, here I have, the three films that came out between 2001 to 2007. Of course, it's Matt Damon starring the eponymous Jason Bourne, based on the Robert Ludlum novels, right? And these were movies that, I wouldn't say I love the Bourne franchise, but I always thought these were very good action movies, kind of espionage thrillers, almost America's answer to, in some ways, James Bond, I suppose, in the sense that I think there's action movies before Bourne and there's action movies post Bourne, in the sense that, so you got the first movie, right? Bourne Identity. It was directed by Doug Liman. Some people think he's a bit of a hack director, I suppose. But he did direct this, and he went on to direct Edge of Tomorrow, which is a kind of cult favourite for a lot of people. Tom Cruise movie. But I actually have a soft spot for the first one, actually. Probably because it's the movie where, obviously, as an audience, you know the least. And over the course of this trilogy, you kind of learn more about why this character, Jason Bourne, who you see essentially kind of floating in the ocean to begin with, he has amnesia, okay? Where he just has an inability to remember anything about him, including his own name. And so we essentially spend the kind of really the entire trilogy retracing his steps, his past, and the kind of the idea, the more that he kind of learns about himself, the more it doesn't fit with who he is now, or he doesn't like about himself, really. But the first film kind of established a lot of what would become kind of tropes within the franchise itself. By the time you got to the third film, The Bourne Ultimatum, you were expecting certain elements, a kind of hand-to-hand combat sequence, kind of inventively using a kind of everyday thing as a weapon. That's a trope of the Bourne films. A good car chase, that's another trope. The idea of Jason Bourne kind of misdirecting the other characters and the audience, in which he's kind of a step ahead, and he kind of outsmarts them, and you go, oh, okay, that's really smart and clever. All these elements became part of the Bourne franchise. That really started with the first film, and like I say, I have a soft spot for it because it's where you know the least. It becomes, you can kind of relive the kind of sense of the mystery all over again, I suppose. I think Matt Damon's quite likeable in the role. He kind of gets, I suppose, a lot of stick from some people, but I kind of like Matt Damon, actually. And in the second film, it was directed by British director Paul Greengrass, who brought a different kind of aesthetic sensibility to the franchise, which is what really became, I think, the most influential aspect of these movies, because what you had was, that shaky hand, which I know some people went on to really dislike. I have too. But I think in these movies, it was quite something. It added to that sense of gritty realism, that really shook things up for action cinema. And the sense of, you had the realism, the gritty realism of kind of, it felt spontaneous, the documentary realism, the spontaneity of what seemed to be the spontaneity of the films, complete with kind of obviously like intense choreography for the action sequences, for example, the chase sequences. And it changed action cinema so much that I always use this as a kind of marker of how much it changed action cinema. Look at the first James Bond film that was made after these movies. Well, after Supremacy at least. Bourne Ultimatum was out in 2007. That was Casino Royale in 2006. How much was it influenced by these movies? A lot. Bond really had to step up its game in terms of its depiction of Bond being a kind of realistic physical presence, in terms of his ability to kind of, whether that's handle weapons or handle people, essentially. Really, I think that kind of, this is responsible for that, actually, Bond's kind of changing its image a little bit in terms of being more kind of, I suppose, serious, or kind of a bit more involved in geopolitics as well. Because these are kind of like conspiracy thrillers in a sense. So this was actually a film which every single film delivered, I think, on its own terms. And you can kind of argue over which one is your favourite or the best. A lot of people love Supremacy. A lot of people love Ultimatum. Ultimatum was the only one I saw in the cinema, actually. And, I remember it getting kind of like 5-star reviews from the mainstream publications at the time, like Empire and so on and so forth, which is a British film magazine, for those of you that don't know. Kind of our most renowned one, I suppose, the longest running, I believe, mainstream film publication. And, and there were people already complaining about the fact that the films were getting kind of predictable because they became a genre unto themselves. But nonetheless, you had three, respectable, serviceable films that all kind of built upon and related well to each other. They kind of formed a satisfying trilogy, almost like a trilogy of films that meant to be made. Okay, I always thought the final revelations of who he was in the third film were kind of underwhelming, actually. You kind of anticipated and kind of already predicted and knew those things. They didn't seem shocking or revelatory to me. So I found that a bit underwhelming in the third film, I suppose. But the first one kind of has these, it's lower budget, it kind of has these kind of independent vibes and humble beginnings to it, doesn't it, I think? And it just was a real breath of fresh air to early 2000s action cinema, or action thrillers, or conspiracy thrillers, I suppose. Right, then, shoot forward a couple of years, what do we get? We get a spin-off, right? What was it? The Bourne Legacy with Jeremy Renner as a kind of, as if there's plenty of these guys, and so we just invent another character. We got that, and then we got the fourth film, which I think is just called Jason Bourne, right? I haven't seen the spin-off, but I've seen the fourth film, and it's, again, this is the thing that bothers me a lot about franchises. When you can watch a movie and you can kind of go, it was okay, but it had absolutely no need to exist. No need to exist whatsoever, other than to make people's bank accounts bigger. Really. Make the studio a bit of money, because the other previous films were successful, right? I think it's not the worst fourth film I've ever seen, in the sense that the characters feel fairly consistent, those that are still about, from the original three. But really, it's like, you didn't need to make this, did you? You've kind of just written this on the fly because there's a demand for it. But really, it was never needed. And what I mean by demand is a kind of commercial demand on behalf of the studios. But it's not a very good film. It's by far the weakest. It just feels completely out of place with the trilogy. And I don't think it ruins it, but it does ruin the idea of this being a good trilogy. The fourth one really does ruin it, I think. So that's my first selection. But like I said, no means the worst. But then again, maybe it's no means the worst because I don't think this is necessarily the best trilogy. I just think it's an example of a really good, solid trilogy where all the films, the first three anyway, they're good, right? I think so. I don't think you can pick on one and say, nah, that's the weak link, which is rare in of itself. The second one I want to talk about, which is the one I don't own actually. I used to own the films separately, but I sold them, not because I don't like them, as we will talk about now. But I have a bit of a kind of personal connection to these movies because I kind of grew up with them, right? That's the Toy Story trilogy, right? The Toy Story movies was an example, some would say, some actually did say, was the most perfect trilogy in the history of cinema, right? Because you had three films. Not only were all three good, some would argue they got progressively better for some people. Or at least the emotional heft and impact of them did. Because what you had was the consistency of the same characters, voiced by the same actors, over these three movies, and it kind of told a long-term story. Kind of in a way that, a TV series would actually. This kind of accidentally did that with these three movies, in which, yeah, you could argue the cynical part of you saying, well, did we really need a third one? But they made it work, and they told a story that fit in with the theme of these toys throughout time, really, kind of no longer feeling needed or wanted by their owner. And, it was a really kind of emotionally satisfying way to end those films and the storylines of these characters. But then what happens? We get a fourth one, Toy Story 4, released some years later, because it was 15 years between Toy Story 1 and 2, I think. 3. Toy Story 3 came out in 2010. Toy Story 1 came out in 1995. Instantly, that's the first film I ever saw in the cinema. So that has a special place in my heart. And I still think the first one's the best, actually. Probably in a bit of minority there. A lot of people think the second one is. But I actually think the second one's probably my least favourite of the three. Then Toy Story 4 came out. Now, I haven't seen Toy Story 4, actually. I will say, so maybe I don't have a right to say this ruined the original trilogy. But a lot of people said exactly that. You've spoiled it. You didn't need a fourth movie. Why make a fourth one? You had the whole kind of arc with essentially, these toys are with Andy at the beginning. At the end, well, you know what happens at the end, right? Of the third movie. And that was just a perfect way to cap it off. But they had to make a fourth, didn't they? They just had to. And I think, a part of me, the reason why I haven't watched it is because I think, when you kind of watch a trilogy and you think, that's great. I don't, even if they make another one, I don't need to see it. Because to me, it doesn't exist. I do this a lot. I play these mental games where it's like, oh, the franchise ends here. It's like Terminator, there's only 2 movies, as far as I'm concerned. Alien, there's only 2 movies to that franchise, as far as I'm concerned. There isn't a franchise. There's a movie and a sequel. Okay? And I have seen some of those sequels. I think they kind of maybe deserve their own videos. Maybe not, actually. But anyway. But with Toy Story 4, it's one of those things where it's like, to be honest with you, sometimes I kind of forget it exists. And that's a good thing, I think. So that's my second pick of a kind of a perfect movie trilogy. Some might argue perfect, but let's just say a great movie trilogy. 3 great films, ruined by a fourth. The existence of the fourth, even. Now, this next one, I think a lot of people are going to agree with here, but I've included it, but I might just defend it a little bit. And that's, I grew up with these movies, so they are near and dear to me. And I probably shouldn't have done, because they're all kind of, well, at least the first 2 are 18s. So I was too young to watch them. That's the Lethal Weapon series, right? Mel Gibson, Danny Glover. I think, for my money, the best buddy cop movie of the 80s. I know 48 Hours got there first, particularly with the kind of the interracial dynamic between Nick Nolte and Eddie Murphy. You kind of have the white guy, the black guy teaming up from different kind of backgrounds. They don't really get on, but they kind of learn to get on, and actually they find out they're quite compatible, and they actually, kick ass together, that kind of thing. And there's, that idea of action coupled with comedy. Lethal Weapon, you could argue, copied the formula, but I think it did it much better. And what I really like about the first Lethal Weapon film, that the subsequent ones did lose, I think, well, lost over time anyway. The first one's really dark. It's quite easy to forget actually kind of how dark the first one is, because essentially it's predicated upon themes of this character, of course, who's lost his wife, being in a very bad place, essentially. And Danny Glover is his opposite. He's the family man. He's the man that seems to have everything together. But it's his 50th birthday, and then they kind of get embroiled in this drugs investigation, and then they kind of learn that actually they kind of really like each other, rely on each other, and in some cases need each other. If I make it sound like a romance, in some ways it kind of is, right? It's 80s action cinema. We've got a lot of those undertones going on. But the second one, really good. Some people prefer this. Some people even say the second one's the best. I don't think so. I think you can't top the first. But the second one holds up on its own. And I think even the third one's okay. I think the third one's good. And it's crazy to think, actually, that the first three movies were made, within 6 years of each other? Because it didn't feel like that when I was younger. But that's probably just because I was younger. Then the fourth one comes along. And the fourth one was made in 1998, which I think was only 5 years after Lethal Weapon 3. But it didn't feel like 5 years. The big problem I have with Lethal Weapon 4 is Mel Gibson is he's aged so much in those 5 years. You would not think that 5 years had passed. He must have had a difficult 5 years, because, Danny Glover, you look at him between Lethal Weapons 1 and 4, it barely looks like he's aged a day, really. But Mel Gibson, time hasn't been as kind to him, right? And it just, for a character that kind of is meant to be kind of physically very capable, Mel Gibson, he is the Lethal Weapon, he is the moniker, the name of the franchise, right? That it refers to. It just doesn't quite carry, especially when your villain in the fourth one is Jet Li, and seeing kind of Danny Glover and Mel Gibson kind of, because they have a kind of climactic fight with Jet Li, because he's obviously, like I say, the villain of the picture. It doesn't really convince, does it? It really doesn't. If it was kind of Lethal Weapon 1 era Mel Gibson, you can kind of suspend your disbelief and buy it a bit more. But in 4, it doesn't work. Now, here's where I'll defend the fourth. The reason why I think the fourth isn't a bad sequel in a sense, or kind of one of the worst sequels. Like I say, the reason why it's here is I think you really didn't need to make it, in a sense. And I think it leaves a lot of people with a sour taste just because of, like I say, how Mel Gibson is in the film. Okay? But it's directed by Richard Donner, just like the first three, so you have that sense of consistency. I think Shane Black might have contributed to the script like he did the first three, so that tone of kind of the darkness with the comedy is there. But what I love about Lethal Weapon is like I say, is both the stylistic consistency for the most part, but the biggest thing for me is you have this thing that's actually rare for franchises, is the characters don't feel like they've had brain transplants. They're still the same characters from the previous three films, okay? And that is so rare, and I think super important. I think it's where a lot of sequels go wrong. And we'll talk about that in a second. And there's actually a real kind of heart to the film. It kind of ends on its own satisfactory or satisfying note, I think. It's kind of sweet. And you kind of get the sense that the characters have a sense of peace at the end of the fourth film. And for that, I think it gets a bit too much stick. Because I think at least it's true to the same characters, in my view. Like I say, they haven't had a personality transplant. It feels like they're the same people. And I think that's credit to the fact that, obviously, and what I love as well is all the kind of the cast on the periphery, the kind of Murtaugh's family, for example. None of them are recast. They're the same actors. You feel like you've grown up with these characters in a weird way, which sounds a bit odd for kind of like comedy action thrillers from the 80s, doesn't it? But there is a sense of innate warmth that comes as a result of that I think makes me want to give Lethal Weapon 4 a bit of a pass. But if I was being brutal, the cutoff should be the third one, I think. You didn't need a fourth. So that's why I've included it in this list. Now, we've got two trilogies that I really like, that I think were ruined Both of them ruined in the same year, actually, 2008. The first one is Die Hard. Die Hard trilogy. Now, a lot of people might argue the relative merits of these three films, okay? First one, for many people, the classic and the best. Some people love the third one the most. I don't agree. In fact, I think the third's my least favourite, and I'll get into why in a second. And a lot of people, like I say, the second one is their least favourite. I kind of like the second. And the reason why is because it keeps a lot of consistencies with the original, you know? Which is to say, not only that, I mean, it was done relatively recently after the original, so Bruce Willis hasn't aged that much, which is always a good thing, I think. When it comes to action franchises, I think that's really important. If you want to, again, keep the character convincing and suspend the audience's disbelief better. But the second one, essentially, is just, you know, you transpose the tower, you make it an airport. The third, in its attempt to do a lot of things different, I think just becomes a generic action movie. It doesn't feel like it's part of the franchise. Really, it's a kind of buddy cop movie, except Samuel L. Jackson doesn't play it. He isn't a cop. But he's kind of given the powers of one symbolically, isn't he, throughout the film? Now, I admire the fact that, well, I like the fact that it kind of tries to tie it to the first one. And one gets the sense they were doing that because they maybe suspected that it would alienate the fans of the first two too much if they didn't tie it in somehow. It does tie in with Jeremy Irons' character, who's really good in it, I think. Kind of just camps it up. He knows what kind of film he's in, and that's always good, that self-awareness. But I do feel it's too different from the first two. Now, I get it, right? Some might say, well, what do you want? Do you want two similar or two different? It's hard, and you need to get that balance right. Genre is repetition plus difference, right? You need to have something similar, something different. But like I said, I think Die Hard with a Vengeance feels too much like a kind of buddy cop action movie to me. And that's never what Die Hard for me was about. Speaking of what it was about, we got the fourth one in 2008. Okay? Oh my God. I went to see that at the cinema. I knew it had bad reviews, but I didn't think it would be that bad. It was. It was awful. Again, speaking of characters having personality transplants, it feels like in this John McClane does. The reason why is because when you make a film that's catering to an audience, a widest audience as possible, so it's no longer an 18 or a 15. I'm not saying certificates make or break a film, but it's Die Hard for goodness sake. And when it's a kind of 12A, so he can't even say the iconic line, for example, you have to tone everything down. You're kind of undermining your own ethos of the franchise, really, aren't you? You can't really do much. Your hands are tied. I think Timothy Olyphant is the villain in this. He's just kind of like a whiny nerd. Doesn't really stack up against the previous three, does he? He's buddied with this kind of nerdy sidekick as comic relief. Again, doesn't work. I didn't like it much in the third one, even though it's the charismatic Samuel L. Jackson, who kind of makes you forgive that, I think, a lot. And that's what I think a lot of people love in the third movie, is the star power of those two working together. But the fourth one's awful. He's too old. It's too much of a gap between the third film, like 13 years or whatever it was. Again, just didn't need to be made. It's really bad. And then they made a fifth. And I haven't even seen the fifth. I don't want to see the fifth. I don't want any more trauma or psychological scarring of the fall from grace. That was, for me, Die Hard, I think, is one of the great action films. It's kind of perfect, really. It's one of the most influential action movies ever made. And I think it's actually really interesting. There's a lot of interesting things I can say about Die Hard that I don't think too many people have said or picked up on. I want to do a separate video on the kind of the interesting things, the subtext and things that are going on in Die Hard. They're quite fascinating to me. That's what I've become more fascinated with as I've got older, because I know the film from the back of my hand. But there's just a grittiness to the first film, and there's a level of craft that's really, really good. Now, I understand John McTiernan is the director of the third film, and I think, like I said, there is that level of comfort, of familiarity and craft that I think makes that trilogy, it's a serviceable trilogy, but the fourth don't half ruin it. And that's a shame. That really is a shame. But like I said, we got a fifth, and by all accounts, that's even worse. So the second trilogy that was ruined, and is arguably the best of the lot of this bunch, that was ruined in 2008, is this. My God, what a shocker the fourth film was. Real shocker. You thought, directed by Spielberg, can't be that bad, can it? It's going to have that kind of, again, that stylistic consistency, someone who's overly familiar with the franchise. Harrison Ford obviously returns as the eponymous character, Indiana Jones. Now, these first three films, again, we can disagree and agree over the rankings. I know some people that think Temple of Doom, for example, is the best. I think that's, okay, minority opinion, but I find it really hard to tussle between Raiders and Last Crusade for me. Last Crusade probably more so for sentimental reasons, but I think Raiders is the best film. Great trilogy, right? Yeah, we can argue about the kind of the problematic stuff that's in this franchise. We could, but America's answer to James Bond, wasn't it? Spielberg, at that time, couldn't direct a James Bond movie, so he thought, fuck it, I'll make my own. It's, based upon, and of course it's based upon the serials, the American serials back in the day. But I think this, alongside with the kind of Bond movies of the 80s at the time, because obviously all the three of these movies were made in the 80s, they kind of showcased the best action choreography of stunts in all of cinema at the time, alongside, of course, some of the Hong Kong cinema, with Jackie Chan and so on and so forth. But what great stunt work and action choreography are in these movies. And then you had the fourth, which within the first 10 minutes sees Harrison Ford survive a nuclear explosion in a fridge. Again, kind of infamous for how bad that is, but that was the point where I immediately checked out this movie. It was hard to... Again, the age is a problem here, and this is a common theme with recent movies, is the OAP action hero. And and not only that, they made a fifth just recently. Harrison Ford at 80, which I haven't seen, I refuse to see. The fourth was traumatic enough, and then there's the ending of the fourth, which is like, okay, now you've really you're kind of throwing the baby out of the bathwater here, because I just cannot believe this at all. So yeah, less said about the fourth the better, really. Ruined a really good trilogy there. Arguably one of the great trilogies of cinema history, of course. So those are my thoughts. Yeah, don't want to rant too much, but let me know what you guys think. Are there any other trilogies that have been spoiled by a fourth? Or maybe it's two films that have been spoiled by a third. Let me know in the comments below. If you like I say, like, subscribe. And as always, guys, I will see you on the next one. Take care.